Hello everyone. Thank you for your patience and welcome to the webinar titled Tips and Techniques for Improving the Performance of Validation Procedures in Oracle Clinical, presented by Dr. Steve Rifkin, the lead technical analyst on the Clinical Data Management and EDC team at Perficient. I'm Eugene Sefanoff and I'm the marketing manager for Perficient's Life Sciences practice. Before I turn it over to Steve, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items, please. During the presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode. You can submit questions to the speaker at any time today by typing them in the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your screen. Please say your questions clearly, and keep in mind other webinar participants will not see your questions or comments. Your questions to the speaker will be addressed as time allows towards the end of the presentation. And if you still have unanswered questions after the webinar or would like to request information about our services, feel free to use the contact information on the various slides throughout the presentation. You can also fill out the contact form on the Life Sciences section of Perficient's website. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you within several days. A link to the PDF version of the presentation will also be included in that email. Now that we've covered the webinar logistics, I'd like to briefly talk about Perficient and our dedicated life sciences practice. So Perficient is a IT consulting company that has clients throughout North America and Europe. We have offices and employees all over the world, including a select few locations that you can see on this slide. The company was founded in 1997 and it is listed on the NASDAQ. At the moment, our employee count hovers a little over 2,000 folks. Perficient offers a whole host of technology solutions for a variety of industries, including life sciences, financial services, consumer products, retail, insurance, and many others. Since this is a life sciences webinar, I'll quickly cover what our dedicated practice is all about. As many of you know, in April of 2014, we acquired Biopharma Systems, which in essence became the dedicated life sciences practice at Perficient. The practice has 4 separate divisions, including clinical trial management, clinical data management and EDC, safety and pharmacovigilance, clinical data warehousing and analytics. And as you can see from the slide, we specialize in the implementation, integration, and use of a variety of applications, many of which come from Oracle. We also offer a number of industry tools and accelerators that complement Oracle's off-the-shelf systems. And in regards to services, we offer anything from implementation integrations to private cloud hosting and custom application development. Now that I've covered housekeeping items and the life sciences practice, I'd like to now introduce Steve Rifkin. Steve Rifkin has been with Perficient and Biopharm in that sense for over a decade. He's been specializing in Oracle Clinical since its inception, which was 1995. Steve has been a part of well over 50 implementations and integrations, and without question is one of the leading experts in Oracle Clinical. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Steve Rifkin. Steve?
Thank you. I'll take the screen control now, if everything works. Okay, everybody should be seeing the agenda. And what we're going to talk about this morning is what is an Oracle Clinical Procedure. We're then going to review some PL SQL concepts, specifically about cursors and the structure of the packages that the procedure creates. We'll talk a little more about Oracle Clinical Cursors, some specific cursors used by Oracle Clinical. We'll talk about the structure of the main procedure, which is the driving procedure. We'll talk about retrieval techniques. And finally, after we get done with that, we'll talk about how these different retrieval techniques affect the performance of the procedures that you write. Well, let's get started. When you complete a form template in Oracle Clinical to create a procedure, you're doing something. You fill in the fields in the form from Oracle Clinical. You do special generate, and then what you get is a program. You actually have a code generator that reads the fields in that procedure forms and actually generates a program. It's a relatively complex PL SQL program. Basically, you can see just part of it. When you complete the templates and generate the procedure, you just basically get a program which will be put into the Oracle Clinical Database or the Oracle database to actually perform the checks that you want it to perform. To get the most out of Oracle Clinical Procedures, you need to understand what that program is, not so much in all the semicolons and periods and things like that, but you should understand the structure, because when you understand the structure, you'll understand more about what all the mysterious boxes are on the form template you input to create the procedure. And that's the goal of this seminar today, to give you some understanding of what goes on when you generate that procedure. What is the structure? You do not need a detailed knowledge of PL SQL syntax to understand the overall program structure. There are a few things you should know about PL SQL, at least in a conceptual concept, and that's going to be PL SQL Cursors and the PL SQL package structure. We're going to talk about these first in a rather high level so you understand what's involved with that PL SQL program that gets created. Well, in SQL Plus, or in any SQL language, you basically have a select statement, and the select statement retrieves an entire set of records. You put in a statement like select patient, patient position ID from the patient positions table, and immediately you get retrieved all the records that meet those conditions that might be in the where clause. And just basically get a list of objects, a list of records, a list of data. Cursors also retrieve a set of records. Well, while in PL SQL you get a list, a cursor allows you to retrieve one record at a time, and then once you retrieve that record in the procedure program, you can actually do some work on that record. You can add things to it, subtract things from it, compare things to other records other data that might have been retrieved. And this is the concept. Rather than getting a whole set of records at one time, the cursor gives you one at a time for you to do work on. Cursors are just objects, things in a PL SQL program. To use a cursor, you first have to declare it, and that basically defines the set of results that you want to retrieve one record at a time. Then you have to open the cursor to initialize it. Then you have to fetch, and when you fetch, you retrieve one row of operations, one row of data for operations. And finally, it's a good programming technique to close the cursor when you're done with it to release the memory that's been involved and used by that particular cursor object to do its thing. Cursor declaration basically defines the set of records. So you might have a cursor called cHeight, and the definition of cHeight is you select the height and the height unit from a table called height table, where a specific patient is specified as patient 100 in this case, and you want to also order it by visit number. So if height is measured at every visit, or every DCM, as we'll see in a minute, you are going to retrieve all those records in the cursor, all the height variables. Then, like a file, a cursor must be opened before it can be used. And the syntax here is pretty easy. Open cHeight. These examples I've given you are really symbolic. They're not necessarily specific and not necessarily syntactically correct, but they give you the idea of what's going on. If you just type in open cHeight into SQL Plus, it's not going to do anything for you. But it gives an example of what goes on. Once we have the cursor opened, we're going to fetch a cursor, and that's going to retrieve a single row of the record selected from the database and places the result into program variables. The syntax might be something like fetch cHeight, fetch the cHeight cursor, and that's going to fetch two variables, height and height var, and it tells when you fetch what variables to put that data into. Where do you want the database information to be stored in your program? Finally, you're going to close cHeight to release memory and perform some internal cleanup that the database needs. If you don't close cHeight, funny things might happen a little later. So it's always a good idea programmatically to close cHeight. Now, cursors are often fetched in loops. So you have a cursor loop. And in PL SQL, the loop syntax is basically a borders, loop and loop end, and then what happens in each execution of the loop. Well, we're going to have a loop which is going to process the cursor. So that loop, the first thing it's going to do is going to fetch C height into the height var and height unit var. Then it's going to check. If C height not found, then exit the loop. If you have no more data, the variable, it's a system variable, C height % not found. If that is true, it's a Boolean variable, then that means there's no more data, so you're going to exit the loop. You're going to start executing here in the program. Otherwise, if it's found, basically the opposite of not found, this is false, C height not found is false, then it's going to process the current height var, height unit var, whatever it has to do with it. Maybe convert it to some other unit, whatever it needs to do. And then the if-then statement, or the if-else statement, ends, and it goes back and picks up the other loop. Many times, PL SQL cursors are nested. And in PLC, in the procedures in Oracle Clinical, that's very much the case. So you might have a loop, an outer loop called the patient loop, the PAT loop. And that's going to fetch the patient data into the patient variables. And if C data is found, that means you found something that it wasn't the end of the file. You actually found the patient data. Then it's going to do something. Otherwise, it's going to exit the patient loop because there are no more patients. Okay, inside the patient loop, we have another loop called the height loop. And the height loop fetches the C height into height var, height unit var. And again, text, if C height is found, do something, process it. If it's not found, exit the height loop. So the execution will actually be, again, if we find something, we process it. If height found, then process it. The loop ends, the height loop ends, it does another fetch. It keeps on doing that until I have to exit the loop because it doesn't find anything. And then it's going to basically process the next patient data. And again, if the patient data finds something, it's going to process the height loop again. If it doesn't, it's going to exit it. But it basically is a loop within a loop within a loop. The procedures in Oracle Clinical have loops within loops within loops within loops within loops. It can be a lot of loops in there, as we'll see a little later. And what you want to be able to do, of course, is to basically restrict the number of loops as much as possible so you're not constantly fetching data out of the database. Because fetching data out of the database is the slowest operation that's going to occur. Although not that slow many times. Now, there are two cursors which are going to be used by Oracle Clinical. That's the patient information cursor and one or more DCM cursors. The patient information cursor is going to retrieve a record with all the information recorded for a single patient. The DCM cursor is going to retrieve for each alias on the procedure question group screen. Remember when you go down to question groups on the procedure definition screen, you specify an alias, you specify one record in that particular screen. Well, that record becomes a DCM cursor. And that DCM cursor retrieves the DCM responses that you specify on the next level screen, the question screen, and also certain DCM header information, like the DCM date, like the visit number, and we'll talk about what other information is retrieved in a little while. But it basically has those two cursors, and these are the cursors that are going to loop within loops within loops. These are the fields retrieved by the patient cursor. These are mostly fields from the patient positions table, if you're familiar with that, such as reported sex, reported birth date, patient position ID, all these fields, and also these other cursor fields, which are variables, the clinical study version ID, whether the data has been modified, what the procedure ID is, internal variables that are stored in many of the Oracle clinical tables as key fields that you may need to be able to retrieve other information from the database that's not normally retrieved by the normal DCM cursors. The fields retrieved in the DCM cursor are these outside of the actual questions that you specify. You get the actual event ID, the clinical event name, clinical event ID, DCM date, what DCM you're actually accessing, the DCID and subset sequence number. You get the DCI time, which isn't used very often, but it's possible to put that as part of the header information. It's the lab. You also have lab information, what lab it's from, what the lab ID is, what the subset number is. If it's a qualified DCM, you get the qualifying value. You get the entry timestamp of the received DCM, as well as the received DCM ID itself. You get a repeat sequence number, and we'll see how that's more in a little while. And we also get a sub-event number and a visit number. So these fields are all retrieved when a DCM cursor gets fetched, as well as the DCM variables themselves. In order to use this information in the procedure, for the patient cursor fields, if the value starts over the V, you simply reference it V_field. You preface that with the RxCPDSTD dot, and then the name of the field that you want to retrieve, you want to actually start to use. If it doesn't start with a V, it's RxCPDSTD dot patient_rec dot name of the data, and that will allow you to have access to that specific patient cursor field in your procedure. When to reference, as you probably know, to reference the I actually don't have it here. I left out a slide, unfortunately. To reference any DCM cursor, it's simply the alias for the cursor dot the name of the question. So if I want to reference lab ID and the cursor is called, and the alias is a.lab, a.lab ID, or a. Start date, or a. medication, depending upon what the particular DCM is. The alias is used to reference that with a simple dot, getting the DCM cursor fields. Okay. When you generate a package, generate an Oracle clinical procedure, you basically create a PLC package. PLC packages contain one or more functions and or procedures and have two sections. The specification section basically lists all the procedures and all the functions in the package. It declares all the cursors and all the variables to be available to all the functions and procedures, sort of the common area for the package. I'm dating myself. I'm back to Fortran terminology, which was a long time ago. Many of you probably not even heard of Fortran. In any event, the specification is sort of the common area. It's all the stuff that's common to all the procedures in the package. The body contains the actual code, the procedural code, which defines how the procedures or the functions will operate and what values they return or values they will modify. Here's the package specification in Oracle Clinical. When you look at that procedure that gets generated, you look at that package that gets generated, you get create package, and it's called RCPD, and then it's an underscore with two numbers. Basically, the first number is the package internal procedure ID from Oracle Clinical, and this is going to be the version number. And then the package in the specification section lists all the cursors that are going to be defined. And again, we're going to have one or more cursors. We'll actually have two or more cursors, depending on how many procedure question groups you have. You end up getting two cursors for each procedure question group. And then we have the specification section ends with the three PL/SQL procedures. Procedure main, procedure insert discrepancy, and procedure insertion handling. These two are built into Oracle Clinical, and you really can't change those. The main procedure is what actually gets generated when you generate the procedure in Oracle Clinical. That's the part of that program, that package, that gets changed depending upon how you set up the parameters. The package body, again, it's create package body, the same nomenclature, procedure ID and version number, procedure main, and program code. Again, this is what gets generated. This is what gets changed depending upon how you complete the packages, the different variables, different fields on the procedure generation form, the procedure template. The second section is, again, stuff that you really is part of the code, but you don't see it. You'll be able to list it, look at it, and view it in Oracle Clinical if you want, but this thing basically gets done automatically by Oracle Clinical, and there's really no easy way to change that. So the insert discrepancy and exception handling procedures call Oracle Clinical built-in packages that can't readily be changed. The main procedure, let's look at a simplified structure of the main procedure. The main procedure is a set of loops. outermost loop fetches patient information using the patient cursor. The next loop fetches DCM information as defined by the first procedure question group definition on the second level screen. And it will fetch additional innermost until, after it fetches the innermost loop, which in the simple procedure is just simply one DCM information, DCM cursor, then the expression details are going to be evaluated. So let's look at that as a picture. One procedure question group. We have loop, the patient loop, and that fetches the patient cursor. It fetches things like the patient sex, the patient gender, the patient number, lots of information about the patient. Then we do a loop for the first DCM. We fetch the DCM cursor. Then we execute the details. The detail lines, again, are defined on that, I guess it's, well, the second level screen or the first screen of the procedure. When we can't fetch anymore, we execute the details, then fetch the next DCM loop. And we continue to do that until there is no more, and when there are no more, we end the exit DCM loop and fetch the next patient. If there are no more patients for this particular DCM, we're going to end the patient loop, and we're done executing the procedure. If we have two procedure question groups, which is common too, still pretty simplified, we again loop by getting the patient information. We fetch the patient cursor. Then we get patient DCM1. And then we get the data for patient DCM2. And then we execute the details. So we get data from two separate DCMs, two separate CRS, if you like, and simplistically. And then we execute the details. Then we end the DCM2 loop, and we fetch the next DCM2 cursor. We keep on doing this until there are no more DCM2 variables defined. And then we go back and fetch the next DCM. And then we begin to fetch DCM2 again from the beginning. So we end up comparing every DCM2 fetch with every DCM1 fetch, a Cartesian join. We have no more DCM1s. We end that loop and fetch the next patient. If there are no more patients, we're out of that loop. So we have loops within loops within loops. Now, as I said before, you want to minimize the amount of fetching that you're doing because that's the slowest part of database operation. It's not that slow anymore. They buffer quite a bit with so much more memory being so more frequent these days. But it still is the slowest living because you still have a lot of things that have to be done. So in order to limit the retrievals and therefore probably improve performance, we need to apply some techniques. And the three techniques I'm going to discuss here are going to be correlation, qualifying expressions, the where clause extension, and limiting the values retrieved by the cursor itself. Limiting the visits, rather, retrieved by the cursor. You can correlate on a specific event, like on the same visit between the inner cursor and the outer cursor. You can limit it on qualifying, You can also limit on the qualifying question value. If you're using qualifying value, you can say just fetch the cursor with the same qualifying value. You can also correlate on the question values. Question in cursor A has the same value as the question specified in inner cursor B. These all work in the same way, and they have the same effect on the performance. Qualifying expressions are much more common, or correlations are very common too, but qualifying expressions are also useful because they allow you to compare any information between the two cursors, the inner cursor and the outer cursor, to specify what's going to be retrieved. But the performance is different, as we'll see in a little while. The where clause extension, another technique, and limiting visits retrieved. We're going to discuss all those. Correlation limits the fetches for the inner cursor based on the data obtained by a fetch in a more outer cursor. Again, we can correlate on events, on qualifying values, or question values. Let's retrieve with no correlation. We're going to talk about correlation on event. We're going to retrieve without any correlation. We fetch data for patient 100. We then fetch, say, the systolic blood pressure from the vital DCM for patient 100 visit 1. That's the outer cursor. Then we fetch a hypertensive, another CRF, another DCM, also for visit 1, patient 100, for the hypertensive yes-no question. So we fetch from one DCM, vital DCM for visit 1, patient 100. We fetch same visit, same patient for hypertension DCM. And then we test. Next thing we do, because we're on the inner cursor, we fetch the hypertensive DCM, visit 2, patient 100. Now, typically the testing is going to be comparing these two objects. And typically, if the hypertensive yes-no question is the patient hypertensive, and you make sure that the patient is hypertensive if their systolic blood pressure is over, say, 200, you want to create a discrepancy. If it's not, or there's some inconsistency there, you don't want to compare visit 1 with visit 2. But that's going to happen. So you're going to create a discrepancy that you want to take that you don't want to take. You don't really want to occur. But it's not really a discrepancy. After we fetch hypertensive visit 1, visit 2, then say, no more visits yet. We're going to go fetch the systolic blood pressure for visit 2, patient 100. And we're going to fetch hypertensive visit 1, patient 100. Again, we fetch visit 2. You don't want to compare that. This is the one we want to compare in. So basically, we've fetched quite a few extra records that we don't need. Not a big deal here, only 2 records. But again, we might be making comparisons that we don't want to create discrepancies for. We want to make sure those do not create discrepancies. If we correlate with event, we fetch data for patient 100. We fetch systolic blood pressure, visit 1, patient 100. Fetch the hypertensive, the yes-no question from the hypertensive tension DCM for patient 100, test. We do not fetch the visit 2 hypertension because it doesn't correlate, because the visit 2 visit, the visit here, visit 2, is not the same thing fetched by the outermost loop. So we have no more data to be fetched that matches it. We then fetch DCM, visit 2, patient 100. We don't fetch visit 1, patient 100 because it doesn't correlate with visit 2. Instead, we fetch visit 2 and do the test then. So we don't even test the discrepancies, or don't test the discrepancies when the visits don't match. That's retrieval on an event. To do that correlation, again, on the procedure question group, we have the 2 question groups. At the correlate with section to the right, we simply say what alias do we want to correlate alias B to, and we say A, the one above it, and we want to basically say we want to use the same actual event. There are other choices there to allow you to say the previous event or the next event, which might take care of sub-events that might be unanticipated. That's in a way that can also be done, but those are going to be the same performance. We have 2 qualified DCMs. You're going to correlate on qualifying question value. Again, we can correlate both on event and qualifying question. So if in this case we have a vital DCM qualified at pre-dose, be 1 hour post-dose, EKG DCM qualified at pre-dose and 1 hour post-dose. We want to correlate on both DCMs. We want to compare the vitals information from the EKG information at the same time relative to the dose, either both pre-dose or both 1 hour post-dose. If we don't use correlation, or we do use correlation, we fetch patient data, fetch systolic blood pressure for the pre-dose value, and we only fetch EKG for the pre-dose, not the 4 other values that could be used. So again, we're saving 3 fetches and a lot of worry about extra discrepancies. Then we have no more EKG information for that visit 1, patient 1 rather. We're going to fetch systolic blood pressure. And then we're going to only fetch the one that matches, again, in both the visit and the time past dose. Again, we've eliminated 3 other fetches. Do the same thing for visit 2 pre-dose and visit 2 post-dose. We only fetch what we want to compare with what's going on. We can also use responses to questions. Again, it's the same type of situation. On the correlating question screen, you're going to click on that, and you're going to specify that you want to correlate the indication in the the inner loop, with the AE retrieved from the outer question group, or the medication on the inner group correlate with the medication given the outer loop. You're not comparing those questions, you're comparing the values those questions return. And again, the inner loop is going to fetch only records where the indication is the same as the AE on the outer loop, and the medication is the same as the medication on the AE outer group. This is the ConMed outer group, and this is the AE outer loop. I'm sorry, this is the AE outer loop and ConMed inner group. Now, how does correlation change the generated program? Here's the cursor definition for the outer cursor. It defines the cursor. Its cursor is, and then this is a select statement. And don't worry about all this stuff up here, but this is what you're part of the select statement, of course. Notice that what's being fetched is the actual event ID. The actual event ID is retrieved as part of the standard cursor variables in the outer cursor. So when you retrieve from the AE cursor, it retrieves the actual event ID that AE corresponds to. When you open the inner cursor definition, you see that it says as one of the variables, the input variable, it's a cursor variable, it says, I want to retrieve it from the actual event ID this is actually in the wrong spot. That's not true. This is what's specified. So the actual event ID is going to be input when the opening call is made, and that's what we're going to be retrieving right over here, where the actual event ID retrieved in this cursor equals the one that was input as an opening variable or cursor variable. I said the open statement was very simplified because you can open a cursor and specify values that should be in the where clause in that cursor when the cursor is opened. It's a cursor variable. The key thing is that it's part of the cursor. So nothing's going to be retrieved unless those conditions match. When you correlate on an event, it's a little different. Excuse me. It's not a little different. You fetch the AE cursor into AE, and that retrieves the actual event ID. And then when you open this cursor, you can see you specify the actual event ID there, and that's used to open the inner cursor. So again, it's part of the cursor structure. The loops, when you open it, fetches something, and then uses what it fetches to basically open the cursor differently, so it only retrieves the information for that specific actual event ID for the one that matches the outer loop. Other types of correlation, qualifying question values work in the same way. When the procedure compiles, the procedure question group cursors are going to be restricted. And opening of cursors, the main procedure, you use cursor variables to basically specify how the cursor is going to be opened. Qualifying expressions are a little different. The qualifying expressions, again, it's on the procedure question group screen. It's on the qualifying expression field. And here we say we want to only fetch those records if the medication on the AE form is not null. Basically, there is an AE. There is a medication that provides the AE. In general, qualifying expressions allow you to join values between the cursors and the qualifying expressions based on anything that is retrieved above, or anything that is retrieved, I should say, or retrieved above, at that level or above, and at a more outer level. How do the qualifying expressions change the generated program? Well, you have a patient record loop, just like before, and we have the AE cursor loop, an outer loop, and we have the inner loop. But notice you have this big section here, and this is where we're going to do the detail checks. And then we have this fetch qualify loop, which is executed repeatedly right here. Now, how does that work? Well, we have the AE cursor loop, and we have the fetch AE record. So we open up a loop, called AE cursor, and this is the end of it. The AE cursor loop is way down over here at the ConMed stuff. And then we open another loop right away where we're going to fetch the AE. So we fetch the AE cursor into the AE. And then if we fetch nothing, there's nothing there are no more AEs, we're going to exit the fetch loop, which is right here, and we're going to, because again, AE cursor not found, we're going to exit the cursor loop. But notice if we find something, it says, okay, exit AE fetch when AE medication is not null. So if medication is not null, we found something we want to retrieve that satisfies our qualifying expression, we're going to basically exit the fetch loop over here, and since AE cur was found, it's not found is false, it's going to go on here to open up the DCM to the second cursor, in this case the con-med cursor. And if medication is not null, or rather is null, it's going to basically fetch the next AE. It's going to exit, it's going to end the loop. If it's null, it's going to end the loop, fetch the next AE record. And again, test it. It's going to keep on fetching AEs until it finds one that is null, not null rather. And once it finds one that is not null, it's going to go on to fetch 3 more in a loop. So in this case, it's a test after fetch situation. Okay? That's a little slower because we're fetching. We're not doing anything after we fetch, but we're still fetching and then testing to meet the condition. So a qualifying expression is not nearly as efficient, so to speak, as a correlation, which is part of the cursor itself. With a qualifying expression, everything always gets fetched. You can also limit the cursor fetch with a SQL expression comprised of key DCM fields. An LV is available, list of values of available fields that can be used in the extension, but if you're careful, you can use any field, any other variables which are retrieved in the received DCM table, or actually in the received DCM table, or in the response table, but only for the cursor you're currently working on. You can't reference another cursor in a where clause extension. You're basically sticking on something at the end of the where clause and extensions, other where clauses, other and clauses, onto the DCM cursor that gets fetched, that gets defined. And that's one way to limit retrieval for specific visits as well. You can say just fetch the cursor with visit name or visit equals screening, or visit equals screening, or visit equals visit 1. That can be done here. It may not be the best way to do it, but it can be done here as well. And this is where you put the where clause extension. Again, there's a list of values. These are the fields that are predefined that you don't have to. You can just use those by selecting them and clicking, or any other field which is in the received DCM table, and there are many others, some which are sometimes useful, most of the time most aren't, can also be used. Also, notice the responses table is in the join. Although the response table, the only one here is the repeat sequence number, there are other fields in the responses table that could also be used in the where clause extension. But remember, it's just for this specific cursor. How do the where clause expressions change the generated program? Well, again, it's basically going to be right here. It's added to the default DCM cursor. So if I have an extension where visit number equal 1, it just puts it into the DCM cursor, which is being correlated, or being used the where clause extension, added to the default cursor. It's an easy way to control range of visits, so you don't have to use the where clause extension. By default, as we've discussed before, all patient visits will be retrieved by the DCM cursor. But you may not want to look at all visits. You may only want to look at the first 3 visits, or visit 1, visit 2, visit 3, or maybe the last visit, or maybe the first visit. You can limit a range of visits fetched by providing the names of the first and last visits on a procedure question group form. Again, this is what the form looks like, and the event range is saying I'm going to only retrieve events from visit 1 to visit 3. Visit 4 is not going to get retrieved. Screening is not going to get retrieved. Only visit 1 and visit 2. Also, some other things over here, first and last event only. I can say visit 1 doesn't have anything, but visit 2 and visit 3 has something. I just want the first one, just visit 2. And if visit 3 has something, I don't care. Once I find 1, I'm done. Or I'm going to keep on fetching until I say, oh, I'm at the last one. I found the last issue. I just want the last visit retrieved. How to specify the range of visit affect the program that gets generated? Well, again, it puts it in the cursor. It's the patient cursor, or excuse me, the DCM cursor, because it's on the DCM question group level, where the DCM visit number between, visit number beginning, and visit number end. And these inputs are going to be passed to the DCM cursor, again, as a cursor variable once that DCM cursor is opened by the procedure. Again, it's going to be inside the DCM cursor. So now we get to performance. I think you can probably guess where I'm going with this. When you have PL/SQL procedure and PLC in Oracle Clinical, at least, you get lots of loops, loops within loops within loops. Cursors are going to be open, they're going to be fetched, they're going to be closed many times in the internal fetch loop. Although I didn't show you all the closes, they all got to be opened and closed multiple times. It takes time to open and close, clean things up, and the fetching takes time, lots of time. So you want to use as much correlation as possible to improve performance. Now, some types of correlation, or some types of, I guess the better way is a fetch reduction, one type of correlation. But some types of fetch reduction affect performance more than others. And you may need to reduce the fetches to make the procedure do what you really want it to do, or else you're getting extraneous discrepancies that you don't want to submit to the sites, etc. This sort of summarizes the performance. Event range isn't a DCM cursor, so it's a very large performance effect. It never gets fetched. It only fetches what is appropriate. Correlation, the three types of correlation also have a very large effect. The where clause extension has a large effect, again, because they're in the cursor. The qualifying expression does not have as large an effect. It's a much smaller effect. But it could be a very large effect. If you have a qualifying expression in your outer cursor, then that's to prevent the inner cursor from executing at all for all the bad stuff. So you want to use where, so the qualifying expressions are very, very useful for that. That, by the way, is my call on my other phone from Bridget, who calls me every day to tell me that my credit card interest rate with my second and final notice can be reduced. So I should have called her earlier to myself that don't call me today. Okay. So to summarize, procedure generation produces a complex PL/SQL program. Program makes extensive use of cursors and looping structure. Program performance can be changed by using by correct use of many of the techniques available from the form template. And now I guess I'm going to open for questions, and I guess Eugene, I send it back to you now.
Yes, great. So let's go ahead and start the Q&A session. Feel free, if you have questions, to ask via the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your screen. And we'll answer as many as we can within the given time that we have. So and Steve, you can feel free to follow along the desktop under the questions. Okay, great. So first question is, regarding correlations, if we have a log with several records per page and several sub-events per subject, then how do we identify the first date and time and the last date and time for all the data in the log? Can we do that in an OC procedure, or can we only process that in SAS, for example?
No, you should be able to do that in a OC procedure. Have to use some techniques I did not discuss about. You may have to use order by, and you can order by, for example, the date and time, the DCM date and time, depending on how things are structured, how the DCMs are set up. But it's usually quite easy to basically use the DCM procedures or use the procedure generation, procedure programs to fetch the first and last time from a repeating question group. But it's not so easy to show right here.
Next question is, can you share some information on how to use the aggregate field in validation?
Aggregates. Okay. Aggregates are defined on the procedure question group screen. You check off a box aggregate. And what that does, it creates a cursor, which is basically a select, like sum of something or max of something or min of something. You specify what you want to select on the question screen. And that allows you to say, let's say you have a procedure, you want to say you want to make sure any measurement of blood pressure, for example, is no more than 20% of the average of all the previous measurements. You want to pick out possibly an outlier that's done by data entry error. So you use the aggregate to create a aggregate variable for systolic blood pressure, and the detail you would basically check if the syntax aggregate of dollar of the name of the variable systolic BP greater than 120 of the current VP or something like that. That would allow you to use the aggregate variables. Aggregates are not used that often, but you can aggregate by either sum, by min value, max value. I believe count you can aggregate. And you can also specify whether you include the nulls in the aggregate for the sum and the min and max, or not include the aggregates as well. Again, those are options on the procedure question group screen. But the aggregate is actually a cursor. But there are limitations that you can't use any qualifying expressions in an aggregate cursor as well, for example. That answer the question?
We'll hope it does. So we have another, I don't know if it's a question or what, but regarding lag variables and its usage. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Lag variables allow you to capture the previous value in a DCM for a specific question. So you say, I want to have I measured blood pressure today, and I want the value the last time I measured it in the previous DCM, previous sub-event. It sort of keeps track of all the previous X occurrences, previous N occurrences of that particular value. Again, you can specify whether you want to count the nulls that might be in there as one of the values you want to keep track of, just the ones that actually have data. It allows you to basically maintain the previous N values, and you can reference those in your detail. So you could, in theory, have a question, the blood pressure changed more than 20% since the previous measurement. If you use a lag variable, you say lag 1, again, the specific syntax of the systolic blood pressure is greater than 1.2 of the current blood pressure. Then you can create a discrepancy. Lags allow you to remember the previous, and you specify what N is, the previous N occurrences of that variable that were fetched.
Okay. Our next question is, how do you set up the pat_sync function?
Pat_sync is a function used in Oracle Clinical, which actually Oracle Clinical has supplied, which allows you to move data into the patient positions table from DCM information. Normally, if you don't use pat_sync, you basically have to go through some other screens to enter the patient gender and patient sex and birth date. Sex and gender, the same thing, I guess, but gender and birth date and some other information into the patient positions table where it's normally stored. Pat_sync is a function which Oracle Clinical provides, which basically allows that function to do that information. You pass to it in pre-detail code, some of the custom code, the values that have been recorded on the CRF for birth date and gender. You put those variables into the call to pat_sync, and when you get done, the patient positions table is now populated. Now, if you're doing this in a validation procedure, which is probably the case, you don't want to create a discrepancy in any case, probably in no cases at all. So you want to be able to make sure that you don't create a discrepancy, so your detail line might be 1 not equal 1, which is always false and will never create a discrepancy. If you put into a derivation, you can do that as well, but if you put into a derivation, you have to give it a derived variable, and that makes it a little more complicated. You may not have a derived variable in that particular CRF and stuff like that. So the easiest way is to write a validation procedure to use it. There could be other things being done as well, but pat_sync would be called in pre-code.
Okay. The next question that we have is, can you please explain the usage of placeholders?
Placeholders. Placeholders are what we call null DCMs. Basically, a placeholder means typically, you remember the loops that we have? If you go to fetch something and nothing's there, the loop ends. It goes on to the next one. But sometimes you want to say, okay, we didn't find something, But I don't want to go on to the next part of the loop. I want to do something as well. So what I'll do is I'll check off create placeholder. When I create placeholder, check off create placeholder, the system creates a record called a null DCM, which is sort of a pseudo-DCM. It's a made-up DCM that has no data in it. That is the placeholder. So now you can detect if something was missing. It's going to be used to detect missing data.
Great, thank you. So at the moment, we don't have any additional questions. We'll give it another 30 seconds to see if anyone else has anything to ask. In the meantime, I will show you some contact information. You can find Steve's email address here, as well as our email address for sales and phone numbers that go along with that. You can always visit us on Perficient.com and follow us via the various social media channels. So it looks like at the moment we don't have any additional questions, so that'll end the Q&A portion. Once again, please note that today's webinar was recorded and it will be sent to you within a few days for you to review and share with your colleagues. We want to thank you very much for your participation and hope that the information Steve provided you with today was helpful. We'd like to offer you an invitation to join our upcoming webinars. You can take a look at the list on Perficient.com. Thanks so much for joining and have a great rest of the day and evening.
Thank you.